Hello, I'm Juliet Flynn.
And I'm Zoe Connell, and today we're talking about virtual presence and presentation. Juliet, what does virtual presence and presentation mean to you?
So I guess it's thinking about how we show up when we're participating or presenting in a virtual environment. So whether that be in a Microsoft Teams meeting or in a virtual workshop or any of those other ways that we interact with each other in a virtual environment. And I guess I'm interested in thinking about how different that is. Is it different to interacting in a face-to-face way, or is it the same? Do the same kind of rules apply in how we interact, how we come across, how do we create an impact?
I think it's similar in some respects. There are still things that you need to think about in the virtual environment that you would still need to think about in the face-to-face environment. But I think that there are different layers in the virtual environment that you need to consider. I think the most important thing about virtual presence and presentation is that, we're all real people, and in a virtual environment, that can sometimes feel a bit lost because of the added layer of technology that you're having to interact with.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is something really important about not forgetting that we're all people. And although the mechanism by which we're communicating is different and we're not physically in the same room, that we're all still humans and we've got to hold on to that. But that can be harder, I suppose. And maybe that's the thing that puts those barriers in place, that I don't think we intentionally forget that, but perhaps there is something that gets in the way of reminding us when we're physically in a room together, we're connecting in a very kind of primal way, which is important. And there is some emotional connection, there's a physical connection, there's a psychological connection. So I guess I'm interested in thinking about how do we still create those connections? How do we still be authentic and human in our interactions when we're not physically in the same room?
And how do we manage our anxieties around that? The anxieties around presentation that, I speak to experienced presenters and facilitators, and even they say, even though they come across as the most confident people, they still feel those nerves. And then if you think about it in the virtual environment, there's the added anxiety around, what if the technology fails?
Yeah, yeah. And it does sometimes, doesn't it? And let's not pretend that it doesn't. There's those wonderful sort of sketches, aren't there, around people popping in and out, and technology fading, and you getting half a sentence. And yes, that is the case sometimes, but I think less so than we perhaps anticipate. So sometimes those anxieties are focused on the technology, when actually perhaps the anxiety is around how do I still show up and have an impact. Maybe because the rules are different, so that they're often, we rely on physical cues or presence or some sense of charisma that doesn't exist in the same way in the virtual environment. So if you're the kind of person who sort of enters the room with gusto and is suited and booted and is goes up and shakes people's hands, and all of those kind of physical interactions that aren't there in a virtual environment, there could be a sense of anxiety about how can I still be me, how can I still show people who I am and how credible I am or how impactful I am when I can't physically go up and shake someone's hand or have those little side conversations or chat to people over the coffee table that doesn't exist in a virtual world. So a lot of those physical things that we might rely on are taken away. So we need to think about what are those other things that are maybe there in replacement or are different, and we need to just kind of hold on to or think about in a slightly more deliberate, considered way, so that we can still create an impact. We can still leave other people with the impression that we're here and we know what we're talking about, or we've got something positive and valuable to contribute.
Absolutely. It's so important because, you know, the whole point of having a presence, showing up, is because you've got something to say, whether you're leading or facilitating, or whether you're a participant and you're engaging, you know, and still sharing your knowledge and ideas and, you know, engaging in that way. Just because it's in a virtual environment doesn't mean that, you know, the reason why we should be thinking about our presence, thinking about how we present ourselves is any less. The reason behind it is still, the why behind it is still really important, because we still need to be able to engage others. We still need to be able to have that impact and to be able to communicate effectively, concisely.
Mm. So actually, that's you saying that has made me wonder. Very often we get invited to meetings, and there is some sense of kind of making up numbers. That you might be there because there has to be a representative from your area, or people feel that they need to invite a large number of people to make the meeting meaningful. And when you're physically in a room and you can just show that you've showed up, it is often enough. In a virtual environment, that just isn't enough. So if you're invited to a meeting, or if you're convening a meeting, you've got to think really carefully about, who do I need there that is going to give that value add that you just talked about? Where's the contribution going to come from? And there's no point in having people in a meeting, in a presentation, in a workshop, whatever it is, if they're just there to make up numbers and they sit in the background, not having any kind of presence or contribution. So only get the people there that you really need to have there, that are going to be that value add.
Yeah, the people that you need there, but also think about, it's not just about who you need to be in the room, it's also about what you can give others and
Mm,
who you feel you can benefit through inviting into that
yeah.
space.
Yeah. So if you're one of those people that's been invited to contribute to a discussion, then you've got to contribute. Just being in the room isn't enough. You've got to deliberately, actively be part of it. And so maybe that's the thing to think about. How can you do that? What are the tools, techniques, things to think about that mean you will have that impact, whether you're a participant, a presenter, a chair, a facilitator, whatever role you're playing in that virtual space? What are the things that you need to do?
I think the first thing you need to think about is, what do you want to convey? How do you want to come across?
Yeah.
What do you want to bring in that space? In face to face, you would think about that. What am I bringing to this meeting group? In the virtual environment, it's exactly the same. What in myself do I want to bring forward?
Mm.
How do I want the people in the environment to perceive me?
So there's a deliberate intention there, isn't there? And that's perhaps some thinking in advance of going into that space. What is my intention? Are there particular messages? Are there particular outcomes? And really, we should be doing that in a physical meeting, a physical environment as well. But very often we don't, because we kind of, swan in and rely on some of those other elements of ourselves to kind of take us through. But I think there is benefit in having that thinking before you go into meeting. What is my intention for coming into this space?
Definitely.
Uh,
And balancing that with still being authentic to who you are. You know, I'm not saying you need to pretend to be anything other than you are. We're all complex people. We all have facets to ourselves. I mean, anybody who does personality profiles like Insights Discovery, Myers-Briggs, anybody who does those sorts of things knows that we all have different preferences, but also our hidden potentials. And so what I'm saying is, just because you want to present yourself in a particular way, that doesn't mean you have to be false in any way. It's just
mm,
about recognizing in yourself what it is that you bring, what are your strengths, also recognizing what are your weaknesses that you maybe need to exert a little bit more energy to bring to the fore in how you present yourself. If you feel that that element of yourself, that aspect of yourself, will actually help you with your message, your impact, help who you're engaging with engage with you.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about sort of personality types, and I think there is something in meetings and collections of people in any kind of context. There's something around whether you have more of an introverted or extroverted presence and how you then show up or behave. And meetings, let's be honest, sort of speak to an extroverted energy, don't they? They're about noise and contributions and thinking in the moment, and all of those things that play to more of an extroverted preference. And if you have more of an introverted style, then perhaps you need to work a little harder in thinking about actively contributing. And I think that's the same in a virtual environment. Some of the cues perhaps are different. Some of those physical cues, if you've got video in front of you, then you might be able to pick up on some of those, but not always. So thinking about how you're going to deliberately interact. If you have more of an extroverted preference as well, actually, do you need to stop and kind of step back a little bit more than you might do in a real, in a face-to-face environment, because you're not getting the cues from other people that they may or may want to speak. So you don't have to be on broadcast all the time. And if everybody were on broadcast all the time, then it would be a chaotic cacophony of noise, and that's not a meeting or a presentation or anything that's helpful. So
No.
balancing that input and with the stepping back is also important.
Yeah, as an introvert myself, I love the virtual environment. I find it easier to present myself virtually than it is for me to
Okay.
present myself in a room full of people.
Yeah.
I have to exert a lot more energy if I'm in a face-to-face meeting or environment to present myself in the way I want to be. But virtually, if I want to engage, I find it's more comfortable for me to do so. One of the tools that I use to help me engage if I'm feeling my introverted tendencies are quite prominent in that moment is the chat functionality that
Mm.
virtual environments have, because it allows you to still have that thinking time while the conversations are happening, but it also allows you to really think about what you're wanting to put across. The downside for that is if the facilitation of that and the bringing of that into the virtual space is not managed properly. And by that I mean if people are engaging with the chat and nobody's looking at, and that's not being brought into the conversation.
If it ends up being just a side discussion between two people, then actually you might as well not be in the same room. You're right, that's got to be still part of the meeting or part of the discussion, hasn't it? Just a different media with which it's introduced. But you're right. I think the chat box can be really powerful, and little things like raised hand, if there's the facility for doing that, again allows people who perhaps find it harder just to launch into talking to still say, look, I've got something to contribute here, and here's my indication of either what that is or that I want to do it. So I guess if you're the chair, if you're the facilitator, whatever role you're playing, you have a responsibility to manage all of those inputs. Even if you're not that, if you're just another contributor and you can see that there's somebody that wants to say something, perhaps you have a responsibility to, and you're able to, you can say, oh, I can see Zoe's just made a comment in the chat box that's interesting. Can we bring that in? So everybody has a kind of a leadership role in that space, I think, to ensure that there's contributions are heard.
That helps with engagement as well. There's nothing worse than leading a meeting or presenting something and you're putting so much effort into your presence and nobody's giving you any feedback. Nobody is engaging back with you. That can be
Yeah, yeah,
very challenging. So, making sure that you value the people that do take the time to engage with you in that moment and thank them and show gratitude for that and
yeah.
encourage. The tone of the environment really does help. Setting the rules, having a bit of humor as well if it's appropriate to help make people feel relaxed. Be open like you would in face-to-face meeting. You say things like, do interrupt me, do ask me questions as I go through this.
Mm,
You can still bring that into the virtual environment, but you may need some rules. So you may
yeah,
need to say, I want everyone on mute, and if you want to communicate, raise your hand or let me know in the chat if it's appropriate. And that might be more appropriate for larger groups, larger audiences. So having some rules, I think, can really help you as the lead or the facilitator manage that, but do it in a way that still feels inclusive.
Yeah.
We want everyone to feel comfortable. You want everybody to be able to feel that they can contribute. But you also want to balance that with it being manageable. And I do
Yes.
recommend, if you're not experienced yourself, co-opting somebody to help support you with that can be very valuable, just to help, take the pressure off a little bit. Because you can't multitask always, in these sorts of
Yeah.
environments. You can't monitor the chat, you can't be thinking about what you want to be saying in your message and how you want to present yourself, and then keeping that engagement going.
Definitely. I think there is something maybe about having a couple of people who are kind of notionally leading. Certainly when I've had that experience, I've either kind of been the one monitoring the chat box or the other way around. And it's really helpful to not feel like it's all on you. And maybe so that goes with if you're a contributor, if you're part of it, and you know that perhaps speaking up might be something that's slightly harder, or you're going to go into chat box. Maybe you could, if you've got a colleague who you work well with that you know is going to be part of the meeting, have a conversation with them in advance saying, can you be my advocate, because I might find it hard to make that first step into speaking. And then you might find that once you've said something once, it'll become a bit easier. So in the same way that you would work with allies, if you like, in a physical room, you can do that in a virtual room. You said something a minute ago about making sure the environment's inclusive. I'd not really thought about it before, but I guess a virtual environment actually has the potential to be more inclusive than a physical environment, because some of the barriers, all the barriers are different, I suppose, but the opportunities to engage are greater in many ways. There are different mechanisms to get into the conversation. So that's a really interesting thought. Perhaps a topic for another conversation. But definitely understanding what the etiquette is, understanding the rules of engagement, or setting them out if that's in your role is important. Work with what the meeting's about.
Sometimes there's the risk in the virtual environment of over communicating, because you can sometimes overcompensate. If you feel like I can't be physically there, I can't see the visual cues, then
Mm,
your instinct is going to want to give them every single bit of information in a lot of detail.
mm,
And then I'm going to need a really, really, really long meeting in order to get that detail in. And then I'm going to have to also speak really, 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 really fast in order to squeeze everything I want to cover in that space of time. And I think we need to go back to what we said earlier, being considered about how we communicate and what we communicate.
yeah.
And I think that thinking about what you want to say and being concise is really, really important, because in a virtual environment, there are a lot of things that can distract people.
Mm,
There's more temptation. People might have their emails open, people have their phones. They're not necessarily in an environment that is conducive to, shutting out noise and
mm,
distraction. So
mm.
you've got to hold their attention. And if you're waffling, people are going to drift off, aren't
They're
they?
going to go. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's about, what are the key points I want to communicate, but also allow people to have an opportunity to engage in more detail if they want to. So you can say, I'm just going to touch on the key points, but if you want to learn more, I will share this document with you afterwards. I will
Yeah.
point to you where you can find out more afterwards. And that gives people the choice then to, okay, I now have the key information I need. Great. But I've also got the safety net of knowing if I want further detail, I know where to go for it.
Mm. That's really helpful, isn't it? I think that sense of, if you're waffling on, or if you give too much detail in that virtual environment, people will disengage, and that will happen quicker in a virtual environment than it will do in a room. And there are more options for people to exit and not be noticed that they're exiting, whether it's temporarily or permanently. And you don't want to lose people. If you've got something to contribute in this space, you want to be able to say it in a way that people are left remembering it. So this maybe, offering, as you say, key points, or summarizing along the way. So if you've got a meeting that's an hour long, perhaps every 15 minutes someone in the meeting in that space needs to be saying, so I think in the last 15 minutes we've covered this, or however it is. so that people are still on that journey through that meeting. They're still together, they're still connected, everyone's still on the same page, and don't drift away because they think, oh, I've been here for nearly an hour and I can't remember what we did at the beginning. So definitely that sense of flow and highlighting what's the important things to talk about now.
Definitely. And I think we need to be conscious of time as well,
Yeah.
because I think that in a virtual environment you can't have meetings that are too long.
Yeah.
You've got to think about people's well-being, not only their engagement levels, because their engagement levels will dip
Yeah.
after about 20-30 minutes. That's when they'll dip. But you can't have people staring at a screen. You
Yeah.
can't expect people to do that in a virtual environment. Their safety has to be paramount, their well-being has to be
Yeah.
paramount. And also in terms of communicating in a virtual environment, just like with a face-to-face, I don't want to say, don't want to say death by PowerPoint or anything like that, but sometimes some visuals can help to complement your key message. So you might want to think about that, but you'll need to think about that very carefully,
Mm.
because you don't want to go too far down the route of death by PowerPoint, but you want to find that balance between, can I have some visuals up to
Yeah.
help support the points that I'm making?
Remember also that in a virtual environment, often it says one of however many slides. So if you've put up 50 slides and the people in your meeting can see one of 50, then you've lost them from the beginning.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
less
And
is
less is more,
less.
unless of course you're practicing, what do they call it? That, you do a slide in 30 seconds or
Oh
something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
But if you're going to do that, you need to tell people you're going to do that so that they don't see it's one of 50 slides and they think, oh, we're going to be here forever. So I
yeah,
guess setting up the expectations ahead of the gathering, the group, might be beneficial so that people know what to expect and they're getting into the right headspace. And the preparedness, you've got to be prepared yourself to be in the right space, to think about how you want to present, but also you've got to potentially prepare your audience
yeah,
so that they have that opportunity to do the same. Make it clear what you expect from them, what you need from them, and how it will benefit them as well. You've got to get their buy-in. What's the point in people attending this event, this
yeah.
meeting?
Virtual meetings, in my experience, can be a lot faster paced, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the speed with which you've got to get all your words out has to be much faster. I think, you still have that sense of gravitas in the speed with which you're talking, and pausing can be really powerful. I think the pauses are shorter, because if you leave the kind of pause that you might do in a physical room, if you leave that same length of pause in a virtual space, people will fill the gap. But there's still something about the weight of what you're saying being increased by gaps, breaths, pauses. But keep the emotion in what you're saying. That becomes more important almost, because you're not getting some of the other physical cues about your excitement or your passion or your confusion, or whatever it is. So you might want to think about how that shows up in your voice. And if you don't think it does, then express it in words. I'm feeling excited by what you've said. I'm really confused by the statements you've just made. They seem contradictory. So if you think that perhaps some of the emotion is getting lost, find words to articulate that in a very overt way, so that everyone else who is in the room, who might not picked up on some of those cues, knows exactly what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think in terms of those visual cues, I think if it is possible to do so, do share your webcam, particularly if you're leading and you're in the facilitatory role. There's something about having that connection, people being
Yeah.
able to see you, connect with you. And that does open up other things you need to consider, like, do you look presentable? You know, have you brushed your hair? What are you wearing? Some people advise try not to wear checkered stuff with too many patterns. Try and keep it to be sort of block
Okay.
colours, so you're not being too distracting. Think about your background as well. What does your background say about you? So it's not just about what does your appearance say about you, but it's about your background. You know, if your background is very messy, is that the message you want to get across? And platforms such as Teams enable you to change your background, so you can
Yeah.
blur it if you want, but you can also, one of the new features is you can change it, so you can also bring some humor if you want to. You know, you can have weird and wonderful backgrounds.
Be
If it's
floating in
appropriate,
space or something.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it's appropriate.
Yeah.
But sometimes you know, if that's not the tone you want to
Yeah.
put across, they also do some more sort of officey environments that you can choose to have in your background if you want to. You want to think about the connection, but not too much distraction as well. So with your visual cues, you don't want too much hand movement. It might be nice to have some hand movement, but if you're waving your hands all over the place, just like if you're doing that in person,
Yeah.
you know, you can still use your hands to communicate if you've got your webcam on, but too much can be distracting for people.
Yeah. So that's interesting actually, because I am a hand waver, or I can be sort of more physically expressive, I suppose, at times. Certainly, if I'm delivering workshops, I pace around a lot, and so in some ways, I feel a little bit caged by being connected, physically wired up to a machine, like we're in the Matrix or something, and so my in some ways I do feel a little bit restricted, but not to the sense that I think perhaps you're losing the essence of who I am, and that that essence of who you are is part of your whole physical appearance, and as you said, so just the background. I feel slightly conflicted or unsure about this sense of background. I quite like just people's real backgrounds, if they're at home or wherever they are, because for me it's a glimpse into the real person, and I don't mind if people have got messy rooms or they've got people wandering around behind them personally, because I like to see that kind of the real person. I was chatting to a colleague the other day who's a coach, and he was saying that he has been doing a number of coaching sessions over the last few months with someone, and they always meet in a very corporate office environment. This gentleman wears a suit, and the conversations are almost in line with that. They're quite professional and sort of self-assured. And then he said recently he did a coaching session, and this gentleman was at home, and he was sat there in his room at home, and he had a hoodie on, and the tone and the expression within the meeting was quite different, because he was in a different environment, in a more personal kind of space, and opened up in a different way. Obviously that's coaching, and it might be slightly different if you're in a meeting. Then that might not be the impression you want to give, and sitting there in a hoodie with cats climbing around you or whatever might not be appropriate. But I do quite like that. I love that fact that we're real people, and we have lives, and there's stuff that goes on around us. But it does go back to that thing about what's appropriate, what's your intention when you're contributing to this meeting, if you're presenting or as a participant. What is your intention? What is it that you want people to be left with in terms of the impression of you? And all of those things matter, don't they?
Definitely. And also I would like to add to that that it's about what people are comfortable with as well. If people are really, really, really resistant to putting on their webcams, you have to respect that.
Yeah.
If people want to share their real backgrounds, fine. But if they would prefer not to, that should be respected. Because if people do not feel comfortable, then they're not going to engage. They're going to feel like it's something that's being done to them rather than
Yeah.
something that they want to actively participate in. I think that that also links to anxiety and the psychology of the virtual environment and communicating in a virtual environment as well. And if you're having that role of leading and facilitating, you've got that anxiety of the technology and having to think about all these things. But also participants will have anxiety, and it's about how you create the environment to make sure that people feel reassured, and
Mm.
still feel that they're able to engage in a way that helps them and that makes them feel more comfortable.
So psychological safety. is important in any kind of context, isn't it? Whether you're in a room together, whether you're learning together, whether you're working together, whether you're playing together, whether you're in a virtual space or a real space, that your ability to be authentic, your ability to be your best self will only happen if there is a sense of, I feel safe, I feel psychologically safe in this space. And all of us, whether we're facilitating or contributing, have got a responsibility in creating that culture in that moment. And I think if nothing else, that's the important bit. So our behavior, our actions must be in line with creating that sense of psychological safety so that people can be at their best. And that's what we're trying to do, having a collection of people that come together and be at their best.
Definitely. Couldn't agree more.
So my reflections are that there are certainly things to think about. Intention and presence are vitally important to think about in that virtual environment. But at the end of the day, remember your humanity. Bring your whole self, bring your true self to a meeting and contribute in a way that demonstrates your value.
And support each other. Put yourself in other people's shoes, in the sense of, if you were the one leading that session, how would you be feeling? And so, do be generous with your contributions and be kind to each other
Yes.
and respectful, I think.
Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Join us again soon.